the fortunes had shifted for the Republican Party after 8 years of President Bush. It looked like Senator Obama was on his way, and that was about a month or so before Election Day. And obviously, 2008 was a great year for Democrats and President Obama. So flash forward now to about 2.5 years later, and fortunes have shifted again, as they often do in politics, for the Democrats, and it's now the Republicans who at least seem to be on the ascent. I want to talk about national politics towards the latter portion of my remarks, but I want to start talking about what Skip mentioned in his introduction, and that is what's taking place in the South, and especially when it comes to what's happening in state capitals in the South, because I think it's one of the most important stories happening right now in American politics that it is not getting near the attention that it deserves, in part because obviously there's so much going on both in Washington and the world. But it's an important story for political junkies and for folks that sort of care about trends in American politics and cultural life. The notion of realignment is nothing new in the South. I don't have to tell folks here in Arkansas that. You trace it back to, I guess 64 is probably the best first example, when President Johnson, a son of the South, lost states from South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. Johnson carried Arkansas, but he lost a slew of states in the South that year, even on the way to a overwhelming victory against Barry Goldwater. And since then, with some exceptions, obviously, President Carter, President Clinton being both from the region, Republicans have done very well on a national level in the South, winning presidential election after presidential election. And you've really seen realignment start at the presidential level, trickle down in the 70s and 80s onto the state level, where you started seeing senators, governors who were Republicans getting elected much more frequently in the South. But even during all those years, the legislatures in the South were still overwhelmingly Democratic. Well, what happened last year was that last citadel of Democratic strength in the South, the so-called Solid South, finally gave way to the Republican wave in the region. And you saw places like Alabama, for example, which since Civil War, Reconstruction, had overwhelmingly Democratic House and Senate. North Carolina, the same way. And this had happened. It had been happening somewhat, but last year really put an exclamation point on this realignment at the state houses. But what was fascinating, though, is what happened not just on Election Day, but what happened after Election Day. And I wrote a story around Thanksgiving time of last year, so that's about 3 weeks after the election. And that period, 10 Democrats across 3 states who were state reps or state senators had switched parties from Democrats to Republicans. They were overwhelmingly white, rural, male Democratic legislatures. And almost all of them, to a person, cited the fact that, as the old saying goes, I didn't leave the party left me. And they said, President Obama, Nancy Pelosi, the more honest ones cited self-preservation. But it was remarkable, though, to see not just what happened on Election Day, but what happened since then, where you saw these Democrats realized basically that there was no future for them if they stayed with their ancestral party. And so you saw by Thanksgiving, 10 had switched. Well, since then, even more have changed over. And you've now had state legislatures change control, not because of what happened on Election Day, but because of party switchers. Take Louisiana, for example, where you've got one Democrat elected official statewide there left in Mary Landrieu. The Attorney General of the state changed parties after Election Day, became a Republican. 4 Democrats in the state Senate since Election Day in Louisiana have changed parties. So this is not something that's happening at the ballot. This is their own decision to change parties. So it's happening across the region, I think, vividly, places like Alabama and Louisiana in the Deep South. And why is it happening? I think there are a lot of reasons why it's happening. It's impossible to pinpoint just one, but why has realignment finally come to the state houses? I do think you have to look at current events. I do think President Obama has played a role in moving some Democrats to change parties. And I think the reason for that is, I think it's partly racial, but I think it's bigger than that. I think it's part of a sort of more cultural sort of issue, in the sense that it was getting tougher and tougher for rural Democrats in the South who were state reps or state senators to say, I know my national party is more liberal, but you know me. I'm not like President Obama or Nancy Pelosi. I'm a fill-in-the-blank Democrat, Alabama Democrat, or Louisiana Democrat. That was getting tougher and tougher for them to make that case when you've had not Bill Clinton in the White House, but when you had Barack Obama in the White House, and when you had Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House. Two of the most high-profile people in the party who, for a lot of folks in the rural South, were culturally alien. And I think part of that is certainly race, but again, I think it's part of a sort of more complicated cultural stew. But when I was doing my story last fall, I was talking to some of the Democrats that had switched. There were one in Georgia, for example, was very candid, who was saying the perception of the Democratic Party, not just nationally, but even locally now, is that it's becoming the black party. And folks in Georgia, for example, see Democrats overwhelmingly in Atlanta, so it's sort of seen as the big city or the party, the urban party, whatever euphemism you want to use. But when you boil it down, I think race certainly played a role in what happened. It was just tougher and tougher for Democrats to separate themselves from their party nationally with a president of this president's background. So in that sense, I think what we're seeing is a reversal of the old axiom that all politics is local. I think all politics increasingly is nationalized. You saw in 2010 especially a lot of Democrats who lost or who faced real threats, not necessarily because of anything that they said or did, but because they were bearing the brunt of an angry electorate that wanted to take out their unhappiness on somebody. President Obama wasn't on the ballot, but a lot of these state legislators were. And so they did that. And the fact is, those folks had an R after their name. Had a D after their name, so they are the ones that were punished because of views towards issues like health care, spending. That's what those kind of federal issues fueled even state and local races. And I think part of the reason for that nationalization is technology. I think what has happened is people now get their news and information from such a new array of sources. You have cable news outlets that tend to provide people information from a more partisan perspective. You have talk radio that certainly does that. And perhaps most importantly, you have the internet. My news organization doesn't take sides. We sort of just cover the news. But a lot of outlets on the web now, to say nothing of people's email, are filled with news or information that is presented with something of a very discernible slant. And so I think the impact of that is that somebody that goes to vote for their state senator or their state representative isn't just going into the polls, thinking about, oh, well, I saw him down at Rotary, or he's always at, every high school graduation he's there, or every football game he's there. They're going to the polls based upon not just that or seeing him cutting a ribbon in the weekly paper. It's going there and saying, well, I just saw last night on TV that, Obamacare this or that. He's a Democrat, so I'm gonna punish him. I mean, I just think that the sort of change in technology and information has really had a noticeable effect on local politics. I was talking to a congressman in Louisiana, Charlie Melanson, who ran for the Senate and lost against David Vitter. If there was a flawed incumbent last cycle, David Vitter was it. I don't have to tell a lot of folks in this room, but he had some real political challenges. He won re-election easily, and this is not local. This is obviously a federal race, U.S. Senate race. But I was talking to the congressman Melanson, who is, as his name illustrates, sort of classic, a Cajun Democrat of the old school, and he said, people were convinced that I voted for health care reform, even though I didn't vote for it in the House. They were convinced that I did. And he says, I would have constituents forward me emails saying that I did. And they were convinced that that was the gospel truth. And I could say till I was blue in the face that it wasn't true, but people would believe that email from their cousin or from their colleague at work, or, you know, all of us have some kind of uncle or aunt that forwards emails on. You all can relate in this room. And people would just take that to be, you know, what had actually happened. So I think that makes it tougher, that kind of environment. I do think to be fair, there's also something of a sense that some of these Democratic legislatures in the South have been in power for so long that there was a feeling in some places akin to what happened nationally in 1994, where Democrats had the House for so long that there was just this hunger for change, and folks wanted new blood in the House. And I did think Democrats paid a price for that you can't entirely attribute to national dynamics or to changes in technology. I mean, I think, for example, in a place like Alabama, you had issues like legislators giving themselves pay raises, just your sort of garden variety self-dealing that had been going on for so long, and that, you know, in a tough cycle for Democrats, it was bound to catch up to them. And so I do think you saw some of that. But again, it comes back to, I think, technology too. You know, there was a time when if you were a legislator in Montgomery or Little Rock, and you were from somewhere a few hours away, you know, not everybody knew what you were voting on or knew your record. And there was a way to sort of, you know, compensate for some votes that were out of step with your district by bringing home bacon for a new bridge or for a new school. You know, raising a lot of money, you could sort of overwhelm your opponent with ads, and obviously personal relationships. A lot of these races are kind of friends and neighbor elections. So, you know, I've been there 20 years. You know, I gave your nephew a recommendation to college. So those kinds of things helped a lot of Democrats endure, I think, for a long time. But I think in a place like Alabama, the majorities have become sort of ossified because they had been there for so long that it eventually caught up with them. And then lastly, to try and explain this trend, I think demographics play a role too, in the sense that, you know, the South obviously still very tradition bound, but like the rest of the country, it's changing. And the fact is that a lot of people that had cultural allegiances to the Democratic Party are passing away. The sort of FDR Democrat, or even the JFK and LBJ Democrat, increasingly you just don't see those kind of partisan loyalties from the next generation. Folks in their 70s and 80s, maybe as conservative as they come, but could not imagine voting for any Republican besides perhaps on the presidential level, because the Democrats were the party of the working man, party of the New Deal. Take a place like North Alabama, for example, the Huntsville area. Strong labor presence, sort of TVA, so a federal role was very much welcome there because it meant jobs. Democrats had always fared well in North Alabama. It was ingrained in the culture there for decades and decades. You had some very powerful Democratic legislators there lose, and why is that? Well, because a lot of the folks that have been keeping Democrats in office for so long are dying out, and guess what? There are more folks moving to that part of the state to work in aeronautics or defense in the Huntsville area who come from the West, the East, the Midwest, all over the country, who are in their 30s and 40s, who don't have those kind of cultural allegiances to the Democratic Party. They just want low taxes, good schools, and they're probably center-right on cultural issues. And again, they're getting their news and information from national outlets. And so I think demographics do play a role as well in all this. I don't want to talk too much longer because I want to take questions, but let me just mention the national scene for a moment. Obviously, the past week has been the best example of that maxim that presidents can talk all they want. Sorry, candidates can talk all they want about how they're going to govern and what they're going to do, but it's often events that shape presidents, not the other way around. This president is obviously now dealing with 3 hot conflicts across 2 continents at a time of, severe economic straits, and also grappling a catastrophe in Japan, and obviously uncertainty across the rest of the Middle East. So it seemed like after the Tucson speech, he was really on a roll. He had sort of done the effective, perhaps symbolic, but effective move to the middle that took President Clinton much longer in 95. He changed his White House staff, agreed to the Bush tax cuts, which angered a lot of his base, but which was a very popular move across the broader spectrum. And of course, the tragedy happened in Tucson, and he gave a very memorable speech, and his numbers ticked up, and the economy is showing signs of progress. But the last few days have demonstrated the difficulty that any president has in juggling so many issues, foreign and domestic. It's always difficult to dismiss what's going to happen overseas politically, but if there is some stabilization abroad and gas prices don't spike to $6-7 a gallon by election day next year, I do think that this election will likely hinge, or it's on a course to hinge on the economy and on jobs and unemployment. There's a lot of talk in Washington about where exactly unemployment has to be for President Obama to be reelected. Is there a magic number? Is there a line? I think the consensus among folks you talk to in the White House is more that there has to be a clear sign of sort of progress. There have to be good trends. They often remind us that when President Reagan was reelected in '84, unemployment was still high, but there was, as that famous ad, argued, there was a sense of morning in America again. And I think if they can make the case that there has been demonstrable progress on the economy, that he has improved things since he inherited the recession, and they will say in 2009 that he will be in a strong position to win. It is very difficult to beat an incumbent president after that president takes over from the other party. Since 1896 in this country, only one time has an incumbent president lost who had taken over from the previous party, which would be Carter in 1980. So he will raise a lot of money. The figure that you hear floated is $1 billion campaign. That's a big, round, scary number for a lot of Republicans. I think it's possible that he could reach that with the prestige and the power of the presidency, a healthy war chest, and a recovering economy, if it is a recovering economy, and some degree of stability abroad. I think he'll be tough to beat. There was a lot of concern about whether he's going to have a primary, because obviously some of the moves that he's made, if you do look at the presidents who have lost their re-elections in recent year, 80, 92, it's been in part because the presidents had primaries. It doesn't look like this president's going to have a primary, or at least a serious one. Figures like Russ Feingold and Howard Dean from the left of the party have said that they're not going to do it. So you add all that up, and President Obama looks like he's going to be formidable. But again, there are, as Donald Rumsfeld said, there are known unknowns and there are unknown unknowns. Love that phrase. And so it's tough to look into a crystal ball too far, but you talk to Republicans and they think he's going to be very difficult to beat. A fellow who you may have heard of in this state named Mike Huckabee, for example, has been spending a lot of time in recent weeks explaining just how tough it's going to be President Obama. So it's not just folks in the media or Democrats who are saying this. A lot of Republicans acknowledge that it's going to be hard. And after this, I'll take questions, but there's one more reason why I think it's going to be difficult if the economy does improve, and that is the Republican field. If you're looking at it right now, it's not clear who would be a formidable figure to take him on. Now, a lot can change. Somebody could emerge that we're not talking about. One of the candidates that we are talking about could actually wind up running stronger than most folks think. But this field right now, in the eyes of the White House, is not a terribly formidable one. Couple names to watch. Mitt Romney is the closest thing there is to a front runner. He's got his flaws, obviously. If you're a primary voter, healthcare reform, questions about his political authenticity, personal authenticity, and for some voters, concerns about his Mormonism. So he is not without his flaws, but he is somebody in a difficult economy who could make a case about his record as a sort of businessman, Mr. Fix-It, and obviously has a lot of money. He can raise a lot of money. So he is the closest thing that they have to a frontrunner. I think beyond that, it's really unsettled. Haley Barbour from next door, Mississippi, is talking about running. He could raise some money. I think he would have some problems in a matchup against President Obama in a general election for reasons that you probably ascertain. I think John Huntsman, there's been chatter about Huntsman, the former governor of Utah, is the president's ambassador to China, is going to come back and probably run for president as Republican. Similar to Romney, this is somebody that has a lot of money at his disposal. I think the challenge for Huntsman is going to be how does he answer the question in a primary about why he served in President Obama's administration. Service in the Obama administration, not an asset at this point in a Republican primary. So he has to figure that out. Tim Pawlenty from Minnesota, I think yesterday formed his exploratory committee. He's somebody that is seen as not having any glaring flaws, but fundraising could be difficult for him because he isn't that well known. So a really unsettled field, which is why it's going to be so darn fun to cover for me, and hopefully have an excuse to come back to Arkansas before it's over and talk to you all again before 2012. And with that, I'll take questions. Thank you.
Okay, if you'll raise your hands and let us get the microphone to you, we'll get the question.
Yes, sir.
In Arkansas, we have been, I think, justifiably proud of the fact that our economy has survived the downturn pretty well.
Surplus, yeah.
And so some of us look at what happens out at the General Assembly with a little trepidation because it seems like that folks in the religion of tax cutting are perhaps threatening our rather strong or comparatively strong footing right now.
Right.
Is this going to continue? Is it continuing nationally in the South in particular?
Yeah, I would defer to most of the folks in this room when it comes to sort of Arkansas politics. But yeah, the new breed of Republican has been elected to the state houses across the region. Very much believes in the sort of gospel of cutting taxes and of smaller government. You talk to Republicans, I think there is a generational gap, even within the Republican Party. I think some of the folks who have been elected for years across the region, who are old Republicans or Chamber of Commerce types, are more concerned with balanced budgets and are not as devoted to cutting taxes. So, yeah, I think the sort of new vanguard is intent on tax cutting. That's an article of faith now, I think, perhaps the most important one for these new conservatives. And I think that's where you're going to see a lot of resistance with Democrats, especially during times of economic uncertainty. I have to say it's probably a much more important issue in Arkansas now because you guys can cut taxes. For most of the states, not just in the South but across the country, they're grappling with yawning budget deficits. So the only thing that they're talking about is exactly what to cut and whether or not to raise taxes to balance the budget. So they don't have the pleasure of this debate.
We have a question right here. Yep.
You mentioned the resurgence of the Republican Party. Does that negate, do you think, in the next, say, 10 years, the rise of a third party?
That's a great question. Pro got 19%, Skip, in 92, I think. It's sort of the high water mark. I think if the Republican Party nationally is not seen as being responsive to the impulses of the Tea Party, and it is seen as not keeping faith with the sort of spirit of that movement, I think the most likely place for a third party would be something on the right. But again, I think that would come if folks like Speaker Boehner, Mitch McConnell, some of the other leaders of the National Party are seen as sort of breaching the small government pro-tax cut views of some of their new members. That's going to be fascinating to watch in the next year. Issues like whether or not to raise the debt ceiling, issues like not just sort of the budget now, but the coming budget, whether or not to shut down the government. I mean, there are real differences when it comes to the views of these new Tea Party freshmen and the more establishment figures like Boehner and the party. So I think something like that may arise if in 2012 or 2014, Tea Party activists around the country see the Republicans as not having been loyal to their freshmen and their sort of young, very animated conservatives. Tough to see on the left. I think the way potentially that you could see it is if there's an anti-war movement that would emerge, but with the drawdown in Iraq, I think there are concerns about Afghanistan, obviously on the left, but you just don't see anywhere near like it was during the Vietnam War. In large part because there's no draft. There's a professional military over there fighting and dying, so it's not obviously as close to it to a lot of folks. So I think the most likely scenario would be on the right, but it's tough to create a third party and create a viable third party. There's so many barriers to doing it, getting on the ballot, raising money, those kinds of things. There's a reason why the sort of two parties do as well as they do. It's in part because they've rigged the system for themselves.
Okay, Nate, we've got a question right back here.
First off, Jonathan, thank you so much for being here. I'm a student
Thank
at
you.
the Clinton School, and it's just a real treat for us to be able to have you here at the Clinton School, and in particular in Arkansas.
Thank you.
I'm originally from Jonesboro, Arkansas, a little town in northeast part of the state.
Home of Arkansas State, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. I'm very impressed right now. But I remember reading your article, Democratic South Finally Falls, a couple days after the election.
Wow.
And as a Democrat from the South, I was pretty much struck, and
Yeah.
and I think you hit the nail on the head on a lot
Yeah.
of different aspects of that article.
Yeah.
Going on to what you're saying today, in your conversation you had as a Louisiana congressman,
Right.
how much do you think of the success the Republicans have seen in the South and the failures the Democrats have seen have somewhat been self-inflicted? It seems like Democrats have been continually running away from Democratic issues.
Right.
It kind of reinforces some of those things that the Republicans are trying to push for. I was going to see if
Yeah.
you might be able to speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. If you go back to 2000, and let's just take guns, because that's an important cultural issue, obviously, in the South. A lot of folks think that Al Gore lost the presidency in part because he lost states like his home state of Tennessee, Arkansas, West Virginia, in part because of the gun issue, because he embraced restricting gun rights. Democrats have pretty much given up on that issue. You don't hear Democrats talking about gun control anymore. I mean, even after the tragedy in Tucson, I mean, have you seen President Obama stage a press conference or barnstorm around the country to reenact the assault weapons ban? You just don't see it. So I mean, I think on that issue, I think they've basically waved the white flag. On other sort of cultural hot buttons, I think Democrats are seen as on the wrong side of immigration, on abortion, on gay rights, but that hasn't been the problem, though, necessarily in recent years. I mean, perhaps if you wrap those issues up in sort of a larger cultural melange, I guess, that's a problem for them because folks like Pelosi in San Francisco and President Obama from Chicago, a big city, they're seen as sort of embracing those kind of issues. But the problem has been fiscal stuff recently. That's been the challenge: healthcare reform, spending, taxes, that kind of thing. But I do think that if you trace it back to the 90s and certainly 2000, that has been a challenge, being on the wrong side of some of those cultural issues. But look, you saw a lot of Democrats run on populist sort of platforms talking about issues that poll very well, support for Social Security and taking on Wall Street. And it's just tougher for that to translate now because of, I think, shifts in how folks view their politicians and view their news. If you look at healthcare, for example, there are probably a lot of folks that would benefit from some elements of that legislation who are overwhelmingly against it. Are they against it because of the details necessarily within the bill? Perhaps they're probably more likely against it because it represents a powerful role of Washington telling them what to do on something like healthcare, and it's being pushed by politicians that are culturally alien to them. I mean, that to me is the explanation. I think on the culture wars, it's been something of a standstill in recent years. But I do think that you can trace it back to that. That's where you see some of the problems starting. And well before the 90s. I mean, Democratic problems started in the South in part because of racial issues, Vietnam War, sort of, emerging of the new left. I mean, that was part of the challenge starting in the 60s.
All right, Mr. Johnson.
Jonathan, we have pretty tough term limits in Arkansas.
Right.
And 7 open seats in the state Senate last November yielded 7 Republican victories. We don't see that kind of change unless you have an open seat in many cases.
Right.
How does term limits factor into this realignment? Obviously, it does to some extent in Arkansas, but also nationwide.
Well, it creates opportunities. If the natural inclination, the generic impulse of the voter is to pull the R lever over the D lever now, and that's what is increasingly happening across the region. The default party is becoming the Republican Party. Then it's a heck of a lot easier for a Republican to get elected running in an open seat race, because what's stopping them? If the voter isn't going to the polls having a compelling reason to vote for the Democrat that would overwhelm their generic preference for the Republican, then why would they support a Democrat? I mean, the Democrats who have survived in the South have done so because they have personal relationships with a lot of voters. They have their own brand, and they've done a lot over their careers to help out their constituents. And so it's tougher to sort of tar them as part of some radical liberal national party because they're a known quantity. If that's out of the equation and you've just got an R and a D, neither of whom are very well known, then the trends are such that people are going to pull the lever for the R. So I think term limits would bode very well for Republicans when it comes to realignment, because now every few years there's going to be an opportunity for Republicans to get swept into office based upon largely their party identification.
Yes, question. Yes, sir, right here.
I recall reading back in 1964-65 that Lyndon Johnson told Bill Moyers when he signed the Civil Rights Bill, what have I really done is given the South to the Republicans for my lifetime and for yours.
Right.
So my question to you is, in a sense, why did it take so long?
Mm-hmm.
That's why he's here, by the way, just so you'll know. That's why he's in Arkansas.
That anecdote is, of course, famous for folks who are students of politics and history. I mentioned it in a story. I think it may have been the story I'm talking about today about realignment. And I don't know if it was the Voting Rights Act or if it was the Civil Rights Act, but 64 or 65, one of the two, turned to his aide, Bill Moyers, also a Texan, and basically said, by signing this bill, I'm turning the South over to the Republicans. And that was prophetic. It didn't take that long, though, necessarily. Think about this. I mean, President Nixon's elected in 68, in large part because of his strength in the South. 72, Nixon wins 49 states, including the entire South. Now, I think you had Carter and Clinton, which were regional interruptions to that trend on the national level. There were two reasons. First of all, they were from the region, so they had a personal identification that gave folks here a comfort level. And secondly, 76 and 92, there was considerable backlash to the Republican Party across the country, including in the South. 76 because of Watergate and Nixon, 92 because of the dismal economy and the recession that was pinned on President Bush 41. So I think, and then of course 96 was a re-election. So I think you've seen interruptions to it, but I do think that the march has been fairly steady, though. What's happening now, and you asked why it took so long, well, it didn't take that long on the presidential level, and then on the governor and senatorial level, you saw it happen in the 70s and 80s and 90s with some interruptions. But I think it just took a long time to come down to the state house level, though. And why is that? I think incumbency, I think pork, I think the drawing of favorable district lines that kept Democratic incumbents in power. And I think the ability for Democrats for a long time who were state reps and state senators who had districts that were not that large to be able to go home and make the case that they were not a George McGovern liberal. They were not a Ted Kennedy liberal. They were not a Jesse Jackson liberal. You know me, I am a sort of known quantity. I've done this for this district, X, Y, and Z. And so it just wasn't that effective. And I think what happened is the Democratic Party nationally has become so identified with more liberal figures and these changes in technology that I mentioned, that sort of all politics is local approach, I think eventually has run out.
Question? Yes, sir, right back here.
The gentleman here kind of addressed what I wanted to ask, so I'm just going to kind of follow up.
Okay.
You've given a good reason, but the realignment in the South has occurred, and you explained why, but I guess the main phenomenon that I've had a hard time understanding is how President Bush, basically left the Republican brand in a state, that
Tatters.
is as
Right.
toxic as it's ever
Right.
been. And while still strong in the South, it was, dramatically weakened. And in just 2 years, the
Right.
election rate of President Obama nationally
Right.
was big. In Arkansas and other states, John Kerry, had a much better showing.
Right.
2 more years outside of that, we are having this dramatic change that others have explained, where the
Yeah.
Republicans basically just sign up and they are elected. So how did we have this shift happen so dramatic in a period of 2 to 4 years following President Bush?
I think everything moves more quickly now in life, right? And it's not just politics; it's everything. We're living now in this sort of iPod, iPad world, and people have shorter attention spans, and we move on to the next big thing very quickly. And I think that applies to politics as well. And so I think people now tend to lose patience, and President Bush had sort of worn out his welcome by the end of 2008. His party paid the price for that. And I think a combination of this lack of patience with an economy that really took a turn for the worse, combined with some already established views of President Obama that only got probably worse. I think a lot of folks didn't know President Obama in 2008, but he represented a change from the previous administration. And so they voted for him. I think that some of those folks, in the middle especially, sort of center, perhaps center a shade right, independents who voted for him, soured on him. So I think you saw the results of that in 2010. These trends just happen much more quickly now. That they just don't take longer to sort of develop. It's a cliche, but American politics is cyclical, and the cycles move a heck of a lot faster now than they used to. The idea of a sort of FDR-like Democratic majority where the same party is in control in Congress and the presidency for decades, I think is increasingly going to be a thing of the past on the national level. I think it's in part because of what I mentioned previously about partisan loyalties. You talk to folks that are in their 70s and 80s, and they have these ingrained partisan loyalties. I'm for the Democrats because they're for the working man, period. I would never vote for a Republican. They're for the rich. Or you have hardcore Republicans who would never vote for a Democrat. It's just not who they are. It's wrapped up in ethnicity. It's wrapped up in religion. It is fundamental to who they are. That just isn't the case for folks now in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. Coke, Pepsi, whatever. I'll have one day, one the next day. I'm not loyal to some brand. They're all politicians. If he's doing a pretty good job for a while, I'll be for him, but I'll give somebody else a chance. Who would have thought President Obama or then Senator Obama had a chance to get elected 5-7 years ago? It would have been hard to comprehend. But I think Americans now are less adherent to sort of traditional not just political loyalties, but even bigger than that, just sort of cultural ties just don't have sort of the same meaning anymore.
Todd, we've got a question in the back.
Thanks for coming out. I
Yes,
have
sir.
two questions that are kind of different and help me get through them. The first one is, right after you came, actually about a year after you came here, Sam Tannehouse came. He's a conservative writer, and he wrote The Death of Conservatism. And one of the things he contended was that at the time, President Obama was a fairly conservative president,
Yeah.
and he listed a couple of reasons why he thought that, and
Yeah.
one of them was his Supreme Court selection, another one was his role in the shaping of the healthcare legislation, stepping back and allowing the legislature actually take the lead in that. And you know, there's been a lot of talk recently about this move that the president moved from the left to the center.
Sure.
And I just don't buy that as much as I watch the political spectrum go. I watch this political conversation run and his actions. I really kind of feel like he's been in the same spot all along. If you look at his role, his position on healthcare has always
Sure.
been about policy driven and not so much about politics. And a number of other things. He's always kind of compromised before he needed to compromise.
Right.
And I'm kind of curious, you know, kind of what you're taking as a partisan observer. And I kind of heard you say that, so I kind of felt like you bought into this idea that he's made this big shift, this
Right.
Clintonian shift.
Nonpartisan observer, you should say, yeah.
And can I ask one more question about the message? And
Sure.
you said something earlier about
Yeah.
local politics and all politics being local.
Yeah.
It's kind of an old axiom that's kind of been trumped by this
Yeah.
national take. And I kind of feel like he who controls the message actually wins. And it seems like the GOP has strongly controlled the message in the national debate.
Yeah.
And everyone's kind of bought into that. Really, how does Democrats recover from something like that?
Yeah.
It's kind of difficult.
I'll take your first question first. The second's a bit daunting, I think. Look, I think you asked about me buying into Obama's move to the middle. Let's look at that question symbolically and substantively. Symbolically, after the election, he installed a chief of staff that was a banker from J.P. Morgan, who had taken to the pages of the Washington Post after Parker Griffith had changed parties in the fall of 2009 and basically grabbed his party by the lapels and shaken the hell out of them and said, if we don't wake up and come back to the middle, we're going to get demolished. So this is a noted and unapologetic Democratic centrist banker and a political operative who they don't get more pragmatic than Bill Daley. So that's the symbolism. That sends a very strong message to the political community when you appoint Bill Daley as your chief of staff, and when he's receiving laurels of praise from noted liberals like Haley Barbour and John McCain. So that's the symbolic side of his move in the middle. Substantively, think about what President Obama said during his campaign in 2008 about tax cuts for the rich. I mean, that was a very frequent refrain, and what he said was, if you make $250,000 or less a year, your taxes are not going to be raised. But if you make over $250,000, folks, the days of wine and roses are over. And what did he do? He didn't put up much of a fight at all, and he capitulated to I think centrists in his own party, and obviously the Republicans who were still then in the minority, and he okayed the across-the-board extension of the Bush era tax cuts, one of the signature items of the Bush era. Now, what the White House would say is that's not a reflection of President Obama's shifting position. President Obama is operationally pragmatist, and he didn't like the Bush tax cuts, and from a philosophical perspective, he was opposed to them, but they didn't have the votes to continue the tax cuts for folks only in that middle income range and end them for the upper income. The votes simply were not there within their own caucus in the Senate and obviously among Republicans, so he didn't have a choice. So that's their response. But taken with the symbolism of some of his appointments, I think it is fair to say that he has taken steps to move to the middle. And then also think about someone who has rhetoric on spending since the election. That was the chief concern of a lot of folks, was this sort of federal spending. Think about what he proposed in this budget about putting a freeze on most discretionary spending. So those are not the moves of a traditional liberal. On your broader question about controlling the message, I think that's a very, very smart point. And I think that would take another hour here to try to get my arms around. But there's no question that people now getting their news and information from different outlets, yet they may get the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, but they also get bombarded with TV, radio, email, the web from dawn till dusk. And I think that has changed things dramatically. And I do think that the Republicans have done a good job when it comes to driving a message in a way that Democrats have not. There was a great story that ran towards the end of the 2010 midterms where President Clinton and Terry McAuliffe, his good friend, were just complaining to one another about the lack of a message the Democrats had. And I think that captures a lot of frustration among Democrats that, the other side is just much better at driving a message. And that's in part because of they are oftentimes able to boil down their message to a bumper sticker. Tax less, spend less. I mean, pretty simple. It's more complicated oftentimes for Democrats to explain healthcare reform, for example. It doesn't really fit very well on a bumper sticker. So that does capture, I think, part of the challenge for Democrats. But there are folks in the Democratic Party who have done it effectively. I remember Hope and Change in 2008, and that fit pretty well on bumper sticker. I mean, President Clinton. I was in the library before this. He gave that State of the Union speech, and Skip, it was 96 or 97, and he said 4 words, right? Save Social Security first. I mean, those kinds of messages do resonate. You have to control the message, like you said, and if the other side's doing it better, as the saying goes in politics, if you're explaining, you're losing.
Yes, right here, Kathy, right there.
Other than to make my day, why did you not mention Sarah Palin in the Republican pool?
Oh my goodness. I knew there was no way I was going to be able to come down here and give a speech without getting a Sarah Palin question. I didn't mention Governor Palin or Governor Huckabee in part because they have not made any moves toward running for president. Now, Palin fans would say, you don't get it, you lamestream media. The rules don't apply to her, and she can go on her own schedule and do her own style of campaign and be a formidable candidate. There's some truth to that. Nobody can fill a stadium like Sarah Palin. Nobody is a global figure on the scale that she is in the Republican field. She can take to Facebook or Twitter and drive the news cycle for that day. She's got real power in that sense. She doesn't necessarily have to do some of the organizing when it comes to signing up operatives like some of the more conventional candidates do. But talk to folks in Iowa and New Hampshire, and they have a tradition of wanting to see folks come to them in person and ask for their votes individually, and they want to know also what you're for and why you're for it and how you're going to do it. And they will ask you very directly about those things. So while she is doing some things now that I think are very much untraditional and would lend the idea that she's not going to run, I think it's certainly possible that she could. We just don't know because the traditional sort of patterns and signals and trends that we all go on perhaps aren't the same for her. So just because she hasn't gone to Iowa and spend some time, at a chicken dinner there talking to voters, doesn't necessarily mean that she's not going to run. However, if she is serious about running, as candidates have been, figured out time and time again in the past, you've got to go there, you got to ask for their votes. John Glenn, Hillary Clinton, Rudy Giuliani, celebrities, perhaps not quite of Palin's level, but pretty darn close. Folks in Iowa and New Hampshire weren't that impressed. Yeah, John Glenn, you went to space. Hillary Clinton, you were First Lady. Rudy Giuliani, the mayor of 9/11. you still have to come here to my house, and you still got to ask me for my vote. So we'll know if she's serious if and when we see her showing up in some of my favorite diners in Des Moines and Sioux City and Council Bluffs and asking for votes one at a time. But until then, it seems like she has a pretty good perch right now on Fox and getting paid to give speeches and is doing pretty well. I think what's going to be fascinating is if she doesn't run, the role that she'll play in the primary, because she could be a very powerful sort of endorser, a kingmaker of sorts. And I think if she does that, it would be amazing to see folks make the trek to Wasilla.
Hey, Jonathan.
On bended knee to ask for the Palin endorsement, the coveted Palin primary. Yes, sir.
Do you see what happens in Wisconsin with the union
Yes.
issue?
Oh,
Do you see that as a movement that goes to other states, and/or do you see it as reinvigorating the unions for 2012 in Obama in Ohio and Wisconsin?
Skip has proven my point about short attention spans, because here I am giving this talk about politics, and the Wisconsin stuff feels like it was months ago, not the weeks ago that it was. I think if the economy does recover, Scott Walker and some of the Republicans in Wisconsin will be just fine, and that they will be able to make a very strong case. As it applies nationally, I do think, talking about some of these new Republicans that you asked about, I do think that there is this sense of unconventionality of, okay, well, why can't we go after collective bargaining? Why do we still do that? What do you mean that's untouchable? There's nothing untouchable. That's sort of the mindset of this new vanguard, I think, on the right, who are willing to go after sacred cows. So I think we're going to see more of that, Skip. For Republicans, beating up on public employees, from a policy standpoint, it's not bad, because right now I think during tough economic times, there's not a lot of sympathy from the broad American middle towards public employees. If you're out of work in the private sector and you're seeing a public employee, perhaps he's not making a lot of money, but he's got a pretty darn good pension plan, a pretty good health care plan, and what do I have? I don't have anything. So I think there is some resentment towards public employees that they are obviously seizing on. But there's an important political element here too. If you get Republicans a couple of drinks in them and they get them nice and honest, they will tell you there is a great political benefit here too. State party after state party, especially in the North and the Midwest, the Democratic parties are overwhelmingly funded by public employees. And the ground troops in the Democratic Party in those states are comprised of public employees. That's where the strength of organized labor is right now. It's not in the private sector anymore, it's in public labor. By going after collective bargaining, if you look at that Wisconsin bill, some of the language in there, it wasn't just on benefits, it was dues collection, for example. No longer will the state employees be able to automatically deduct their dues from their members. And if you make the employees have to sort of cut a check every month to pay for it and to have it taken out of their paycheck, that's going to reduce the money coming into public employees. That will therefore reduce the amount of money that they can spend on campaigns for Democratic candidates. So it strikes at the heart of the Democratic Party in a lot of the states in the Midwest and the Northeast. So I think there is an important sort of political battle going on here. If these governors have their way, I think they're going to do real damage to Democratic parties in these states that have become increasingly dependent upon, both for financial reasons and for grassroots support, public labor.
One more question. Yes, sir, right back here at the back.
You didn't mention Donald Trump. He's got a lot
I
of
did
money.
mention Donald Trump. Oh my goodness,
That's a
who
good
else
one.
we forget?
That's a good one to end on, isn't it?
Who else we forget? Are we forgetting anybody else here? Donald Trump. It's like the word symbiosis comes to mind. Deal with the devil does too. Donald Trump is good copy for us. Donald Trump is flamboyant. He's provocative. He has good hair. It's fun. He's going to go to New Hampshire or Iowa at some point, and he'll have 30, 40 cameras swarming him. Is he even going to run? I'm very skeptical. He's done this dance in the past too. You know, it works out for both of us. We get a sort of fun sideshow and sort of spectacle, and he gets a lot of attention for his TV show or for his investments. What I'm fascinated by, though, is Trump's bragging. I could afford to keep it. I don't know how much money he actually has. He's had some deals go pretty bad, and this is why he may never actually run. If you run for president, you have to disclose your financial holdings. Something tells me Donald Trump's not going to want to reveal to us how much money he actually has. So, thanks y'all very much.